Before we begin, every subscriber helps us bring more hidden history to light, so if you're new, consider joining us. A blade rests where a right hand once was. An axe head, corroded but intact, angled across the pelvis. Wool fragments, buckle plates, the shape of a shield boss pressed into the soil beside the ribs. For decades, that was enough. A man buried with a sword in early medieval England got a label, and the label stuck. Viking male, raider class, case closed, move the dig forward. Nobody asked the bones what they thought. Then the bones got asked anyway. Ancient DNA sequencing, run on this skeleton, and dozens like it across England, Scotland, and the wider British Isles, came back with an answer nobody had budgeted for. No detectable Scandinavian ancestry. Not a trace, a man interred with the full material signature of a Norse warrior, the weapons, the posture, the ritual, carrying a genome that pointed nowhere near Norway, Sweden, or Denmark. And it wasn't a one-off. Site after site turned up the same contradiction. Viking weapons, Viking burial rites, non-Scandinavian genomes, Viking weapons, Viking burial rites, non-Scandinavian genomes. Over and over, the grave goods said one thing and the DNA said another, until the pattern stopped looking like an anomaly and started looking like the rule. The number behind this comes from the largest ancient DNA study ever conducted on the Viking world. 442 individual genomes, pulled from burial sites stretching from Scandinavia to the British Isles to Russia. A striking share of the people buried as Vikings were, genetically speaking, not Scandinavian at all. Which raises a question the sword and axe were never going to answer on their own. If the DNA doesn't match the burial, what actually made someone a Viking? For roughly a century, that question had a tidy answer, and it lived in every textbook on the subject. The Vikings were a Scandinavian people, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, who erupted outward from their homelands starting in 793 CE, the year raiders struck the monastery at Lindisfarne, and kept going until 1066, the year the Battle of Stamford Bridge effectively ended the Viking Age on English soil. 273 years, bookended by two battles, telling one continuous story. The mechanism behind that story was equally tidy. Overcrowded farmland, consolidating kings squeezing out rivals, and a technological edge that made the whole expansion possible. The longship. Shallow draft, symmetrical bow and stern so the vessel never had to turn around, clinker-built hulls light enough to row up a river, and sturdy enough to cross open ocean. That single design let the same fleet raid a French monastery one season, and portage across the Russian river systems the next. Historians sorted the expansion into three clean spheres, almost like assigning territory on a map. Norwegians pushed west, Scotland, Ireland, Iceland, eventually Greenland. Danes pushed south, into England and Francia. Swedes pushed east, down the river systems into what would become Russia, trading and raiding their way to Byzantium, as the people history would later call the Rus. Three homelands, three directions, one shared Nordic stock. The assumption baked into the model was that a Dane and a Swede were interchangeable, distinguished only by which way their ship pointed. Archaeologists built an entire toolkit for spotting these people in the ground. Rune stones, a distinctive style of longhouse. Oval tortoise brooches worn in pairs. Boat burials, where the vessel itself became the coffin. Each marker got treated as an ethnic fingerprint. Find the brooch, find the Scandinavian. The popular image that grew up around all of this owes less to the archaeological record than to 19th century romantic nationalism. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and the horned helmet, a detail so iconic it feels ancient, and is in fact almost entirely fictional. A costume design flourish, invented for a 19th century opera and never once confirmed by an actual Viking Age helmet find. The whole framework rested on one quiet assumption, that ancestry and identity moved together, that being buried as a Norse warrior meant you were, biologically, a Norse warrior. It's a clean story. Genetics, when researchers finally sat down with the DNA behind these graves, did not confirm it. In places, it didn't just complicate the picture, it took the three homeland map and pulled it apart at the seams. Here is where it gets complicated. The team that did that work was based at the Globe Institute, University of Copenhagen, led by geneticist Eske Willerslev, alongside lead author Ashot Margarian. Their 2020 study, published in Nature under the title Population Genomics of the Viking World, sequenced ancient genomes from 442 individuals pulled from burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ireland, Greenland, Russia, and continental Europe. The widest genetic net ever cast across the Viking Age. What they found didn't sit inside the 3 homeland boxes. Long before the raiding era even begins, and continuing straight through it, there's measurable gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe and from populations further east, toward Asia. Think of a genome the way you'd think of a river delta rather than a single stream. By the Viking Age, multiple genetic tributaries had already been feeding into what people were calling Scandinavian ancestry for generations. It was never one clean channel. 2 specific cases carry the weight of the whole anomaly. In Denmark, researchers examined a boat grave holding 2 men, buried side by side, dressed and equipped identically. Full warrior burial, matching ritual, no visible distinction in how either man was treated in death. Their DNA told 2 different stories. One had close, clear Scandinavian ancestry. The other's genome pointed towards southern Europe. Same grave, same ritual, same weapons, different ancestral map entirely. In Orkney, the pattern flips in a different direction. Skeletons buried with full Norse ritual. Weapons, grave orientation, the whole ceremonial package. Carried ancestry that was, genetically, indistinguishable from the local Pictish and British populations already living on the islands. Not Norway. Not Scandinavia at all. Buried as a Viking. Genetically, a local. Layer onto that the physical evidence the study turned up almost as an aside. Individuals interred as Vikings carrying alleles for brown hair and dark eyes, directly undercutting the blonde, blue-eyed archetype the 19th century had sold so successfully. Meanwhile, some of the burials with the sparsest grave goods, the ones archaeologists would have ranked lowest in status, or Vikingness, carried the strongest, clearest Scandinavian ancestry signals in the entire dataset. Sit with what that means for the story from a few minutes ago. The consensus model assumed identity followed bloodline, that a Dane looked, ritually, like a Dane because he was one. The anomaly says the opposite happened. Bloodline followed nothing. People with 0 Scandinavian ancestry were being armed, buried, and ritualized, exactly like the genetically pure Scandinavians beside them. Viking identity, at least in these cases, looks less like something you were born into and more like something you were given, or something you claimed. Not by chance, not by accident, by ritual. And if identity could be granted rather than inherited, the raiding narrative itself needs a second look. Some of the crews that terrorized English and Frankish coastlines weren't cohesive Scandinavian warbands at all. At a genetic level, they were already mixed before a single oar hit the water. If genetics alone can't explain who ended up in those boats, there's a mainstream theory that tries to answer it directly. Researchers are careful to frame what follows as probability, not certainty. But it's the leading explanation on the table, and it has a specific, well-documented problem of its own. The first theory says the mismatch comes down to recruitment, not bloodline. Viking warbands and trading fleets, under this model, picked up local manpower at every stop along their routes. Orkney, the Hebrides, Ireland, Normandy, absorbing new members as they moved, until Viking stopped functioning as an ethnic label and started functioning as a job description, achievable within a single generation of contact with Norse culture. The numbers back up at least part of this. In some burial clusters across the British Isles, researchers estimate that more than a third of individuals identified archaeologically as Norse carried ancestry that was predominantly local rather than Scandinavian. The sagas themselves back it up too. Old Norse texts describe non-Scandinavian warriors joining raiding fleets as a matter of course, not exception. And the place name record across the Danelaw, the swath of England under Norse control, shows Norse and British culture blending at a pace fast enough to be visible within decades of the mid-800s. It's a workable theory. It's also incomplete. Recruitment explains why a mixed crew might wash up on a foreign beach and get folded into a warband abroad. It does not explain why individuals with 0 Scandinavian ancestry were being buried inside Scandinavia itself, under full Norse ritual, generations before any large-scale return migration could plausibly account for their presence there. The direction of travel the theory needs, foreign blood moving inward, not just Norse blood moving outward, isn't something recruitment on foreign soil can produce. It gets worse for the theory when you look at the reverse case buried in the same dataset. Some individuals with unmistakably Scandinavian ancestry, as clean and Nordic a genetic profile as the study found anywhere, were interred with no Norse grave goods at all. Full cultural assimilation into a foreign identity, with the bloodline sitting invisible underneath it. Recruitment can explain outsiders becoming Vikings. It cannot explain Vikings quietly becoming everyone else, leaving no trace on the surface of the grave. So recruitment accounts for the road leading out of Scandinavia. It says nothing about what was already moving into Scandinavia, quietly, for centuries, long before the first longship ever left the shore. There's a second explanation on the table, one that pushes the timeline back much further than 793 CE, and complicates almost everything the recruitment model assumes. That second explanation doesn't start at Lindisfarne. It doesn't start in the Viking Age at all. It starts centuries earlier, in the slow, undocumented traffic of people moving into Scandinavia long before anyone called them Vikings, and it says the mixing wasn't a side effect of the raids. It was the reason the raids happened the way they did. The 2020 dataset traces continuous, gradual gene flow into Scandinavia from southern Europe and from populations further east, toward the Baltic and the Asian steppe, running for centuries before 793 CE. Not a wave, a slow current, the kind you don't notice moving until you check where the water started and where it ended up. By the time the first longship left port, Scandinavian ancestry was already a composite, built from tributaries that had been feeding in for generations, long before anyone needed a word for Viking at all. Here's what that does to the theory that came before it. If the mixing predates the raids by centuries, then recruitment abroad isn't the origin of Viking genetic diversity. It's the visible tip of something much older and much quieter, already sitting underneath the surface before the first warband ever assembled. The raids didn't create a multi-ethnic Viking world. A multi-ethnic Scandinavia created the raids. The purity the first theory needed as a starting point. A clean, homogeneous Nordic population that later went out and mixed with everyone else, never existed to begin with. There was no clean state to return to. There never had been one. And the picture fractures even further once you stop treating Viking as one genetic population and start looking region by region. Swedish Viking-era sites show stronger genetic ties eastward, toward the Baltic and the river trade routes that fed into Rus territory, and eventually Byzantium. Danish sites lean closer to Central Europe. Two Viking populations, both raiding, both trading, both leaving nearly identical grave goods behind, and genetically, pointing in two different directions on the map. There was never a single Viking genome to trace. There were several, moving on separate, overlapping timelines, all filed under the same word. Here is where the story gets harder to sit with. There's a third possibility on the table, and it's the one most researchers are hesitant to say out loud. Because it doesn't just complicate the genetics. It questions whether genetics was ever the right tool for the job. What if Viking was never a genetic category the people themselves would have recognized at all? Think of it less like a bloodline and more like a uniform. Roman didn't mean a single ancestry either. It meant citizenship, culture, allegiance, something you could earn or be granted, not something locked into your parentage. The Viking Age data is consistent with an identity that worked the same way. A status, a role, a warrior caste marker that had nothing to do with which rivers your ancestors came down. The problem is that DNA can't confirm it. Ancient people left no diaries explaining how they saw themselves. Geneticists can measure ancestry proportions down to fine percentages. They cannot read self-identity out of a femur, so this stays hedged, and researchers are careful to keep it that way. Probability, not certainty, an interpretation running alongside the genomic data, rather than proven by it. But sit with the implication anyway. If Viking identity wasn't hereditary, then the Viking bloodline that Scandinavian nationalism leaned on for 2 centuries, the one still sold in ancestry kits and family lore today, may be something invented after the fact. A story built backward from a word, rather than a word built forward from a bloodline. Go back further than any of the theories, past the raids, past the sagas, to a beach that doesn't have a name yet in any language anyone in this story would recognize. You're standing on the shingle at Ribe, on the Danish coast, and it's the early 8th century, decades before Lindisfarne, before Viking means anything to anyone. Ribe is already Denmark's oldest town, already running as an international trading post as far back as 704 CE. Stand still and listen. Frisian traders haggling over prices. Frankish merchants. Slavic dialects drifting over from the eastern stalls. Old Norse cutting through all of it, one voice among several, not the only one. Walk the workshops, and the evidence is in the dirt, not just in the sound. Glass beads imported from hundreds of miles away. Pottery hauled up from the Rhineland. Comb makers working reindeer antler traded down from the far north of Scandinavia, turning raw material from one end of the continent into finished goods for buyers from another. This is decades before anyone marks a Viking Age on a timeline, and the trade network is already dense enough to move goods, language, and people across 1,000 miles of coastline. Watch a ship get loaded at the dock. The crew standing on it is already mixed. a local Danish boy, a Frisian trader's son signing on for the voyage, a man whose grandmother came up the Rhine trade routes from somewhere much further south. Nothing about their clothing or their speech marks one as more Viking than another. 90 years before Lindisfarne, the raid the textbooks use as Year Zero, this is already what Scandinavia looks like. The mixing wasn't a consequence of the Viking Age, it was the precondition for it. Here is what 2 centuries of horned helmet mythology got backward. The Viking Age was never the story of one Scandinavian people spreading outward into a waiting world. The genetic evidence says Scandinavia was already a crossroads. Southern European ancestry, Baltic ancestry, ancestry reaching towards Central and South Asia, all absorbed over centuries before a single longship ever cleared the harbor. The raiders who terrorized Lindisfarne, who sacked Paris, who reached as far south as Seville, were themselves, at a genetic level, already the product of the very mixing their raids are usually credited with starting. Go back to that first skeleton, sword at the hip, axe across the pelvis, catalogued for decades as a Viking raider with no Scandinavian DNA to show for it. That wasn't an exception. It wasn't a fluke the researchers happened to stumble onto. It was the norm, operating in plain sight the entire time, hidden by grave goods that told archaeologists exactly what to assume and gave them no reason to check further. Go back to the 2 men in the Danish boat grave. Identical ritual, identical weapons, one genome pointing towards Scandinavia and one pointing towards Southern Europe. Not a strange anomaly. Viking society functioning exactly as it always had, indifferent to bloodline in a way that modern nationalism, 2 centuries later, would erase completely. And here is the reveal underneath the reveal. The pure Nordic Viking image, manufactured in the 19th century and pressed later into the service of specific nationalist and racial ideologies across Scandinavia and beyond, is directly contradicted by the very ancient DNA that generation of ideologues assumed would confirm it. The evidence that was supposed to prove a bloodline instead dissolved it. Not proven. Undone. Genetics can now show, with real precision, that the mixing happened, where it came from, roughly when, in what proportions. What it cannot do is tell you how a person standing in a Viking Age hall would have described their own identity, or whether purity was ever a category that mattered to them at all. One archaeologist working adjacent to this data has described the feeling of standing over a boat burial and realizing the 2 men inside it would never have understood the modern argument about which one was the real Viking. To them, there may not have been a question to answer in the first place. Zoom out from Scandinavia entirely, and this stops being a Viking story. Run the same ancient DNA analysis on any pure ancestral identity, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, Han Chinese, Zulu, and the same pattern surfaces underneath every one of them. Centuries of movement, mixing, and absorption sitting quietly beneath a label that was always sold as clean and singular. The Viking case isn't unique, it's simply the best documented version of a pattern that runs through every population humans have ever tried to draw a hard line around, best preserved bones, richest burial record. Now, the largest ancient genome dataset ever assembled for a single historical period, which is why this is the story that finally broke the myth open in public, even though the myth was never true anywhere else either. That matters for more than textbooks. The Viking blood millions of people claim today, through ancestry kits, through family stories passed down at kitchen tables, through a certain kind of national pride, was never a single bloodline to begin with. It was a moving target the entire time. Decades and centuries deep, long before anyone thought to test it. Think of it less like a bloodline and more like a river delta. The kind that looks like one body of water from a distance but is really dozens of channels braiding into each other, splitting and rejoining. None of them pure, none of them separate for long. You can test the water anywhere along that delta and get a different answer depending on exactly where you dip the cup. That's what Viking DNA turns out to be. Not a source, a confluence. The Vikings were never who we thought. The DNA didn't answer the question everyone assumed it would. It proved the question itself had been wrong all along. And it left the river running exactly where it's always run, wide open, past the edge of what any single grave can explain.